Let's talk about how to choose the right podcasting format for your show. And before we talk about anything, let me just go back to the overview here. So, what is a podcast format? Let's talk about that. So, a podcast format is actually a way to organize your show's content. And a format is actually a delivery method that gives your podcast a structure. The right format will keep your content organized and make it accessible to your listeners, which is really important. Without a strong format, your show will seem disjointed and messy, which you don't want anyway, okay? And podcast formats always create consistency to your listeners. When you stick to a format, your listeners will know what to expect when they will open each new episode. Think about it as your sonic branding, your audio branding, okay? And if your shows feature a serious logo monologue one week, a comedic panel the next, and a fictional story the week after, you will have a hard line holding on to your listeners. So because people will never know what to expect. And when it comes to any type of content that you create, if you're trying to solidify your listener base or your user base, you need to have consistency. And also, one thing we have found in our research is that a good format will help your listeners describe your show to their friends. And they'll be able to say, well, it's two guys drinking beer and reviewing the latest movies, or it's an 8-episode story about a haunted town in New England, right? It's all about summarizing your podcast the right way. And that, most importantly, sticking to a single format will make your life a lot easier. It's much simpler to plan content ahead of time when you know how you will ship it for each episode, okay? This is important. So when we talk about the podcast format, this is what it is. Now let's talk about a podcast structure. So podcast structure, on the other hand, defines how you deliver on your chosen format. It defines the framework, all the segments your podcast show will include. And as you can imagine, different podcast formats will use different structures or frameworks. And that said, there are several key elements every podcast episode should include. And so those critical podcast structure elements include the intro. So the intro tells listeners what your show is about and present a hook to get them to continue listening. The content of the episode. So this section will largely depend on the format you have chosen for your podcast. And the outro closing is actually the closing format for each episode. And this will include maybe a call to action, a promise of what's coming next in your show, and also asking listeners to rate, review, and subscribe to your show. Very important, okay? By the way, boss, welcome back to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here. Make yourself comfortable. We are going to talk about how to choose the right podcast format for your show. Let me give you a few pro tips here. And the question is, what's the best way to convey your topic's information? Now, when we talk about the best ways to convey your topic's information, we got to talk about three things. First, we got to talk about your personality. In other words, what kind of personality do you have? Are you an open? Are you like the thing is, the personality plays an important role in how you narrate the story, how you actually narrate the recording. Okay, your style actually is part of your personality. So that's the first thing. Your personality, your style, the emotions that come out of your voice, everything. Those are important elements. That's number one. The second thing is you also need to think about your target audience. So when we talk about how to convey your topic's information, you got to really think about your target audience. There's a strong correlation between your target audience and the way you convey this information to them. You don't talk to 50 years old or 60 years old the same way that you talk to teenagers, or the same way you talk to women in their 20s. Okay, there are every demographic requires a specific type of I would say communication process. So that's the second thing. The third thing is you need to think about the type of equipment you currently have, because to convey your topic's information, you got to really know if you have like a video, if you are having a video podcast, or this is just a regular podcast. If the microphone is the kind of microphone you have, all the other logistics that you have to think about. So the first thing you should consider is how you want to convey your information. In most cases, answering this question will decide your podcast format for you. For example, if you want to expose your audience to expert level advice that you don't personally have, the interview podcast format makes the most sense. This is a simple and effective way of bringing in expert knowledge from people who live and breathe those topics. If you want to tell a fictional story, the podcast theater format is the most logical. You also need to consider the tone of your show. Do you intend to be funny? That's much easier to accomplish with multiple people, so you should choose the panel or co-hosted format. Do you intend to be mellow and stoic? The monologue or non-fictional storytelling formats may be more appropriate for your show, so be very clear about that. By the way, boss, I want to quickly remind you about today's topic. We're having a conversation about how to choose the right podcast format for your show. I want to give you an approach here. Which format will help your show stand out? Because you have a lot of formats, but it's really important that if you want to be successful and you want to have a successful podcast show in the future, you got to have the right format. So you want to consider how you can make your show stand out from the crowd. Differentiation is really important. You're not the only show. You're not the only podcast. If you go on Apple Podcasts or Spotify Podcasts, you have thousands of podcasts. And it's important to understand that you can actually beat your competition by podcasting on the same topic, but in a different format, right? When listeners search for new shows to join, they'll scroll through a sea of interview style shows and only stop when something stands out. For instance, if everyone in your niche is using an interview podcast format, you might try using a panel of guests to set yourself apart. You might opt to use a format that's traditionally hard for your niche because you know you'll be the only one doing it. Or you could actually get really weird. You can get really weird and turn your lessons into stories using the podcast theater format. That would be so unusual that people will have to check it out. Okay, so it's all about differentiating yourself. It's all about how to make yourself stand out. And another benefit of choosing a podcast format stands out from the competition is that you don't have to take from your competitors' audiences in order to grow, right? If your show is sufficiently different than other shows with the same topic, listeners will opt to listen to both because they don't feel repetitive. Okay, and if you've been listening to several podcasts, you know that repetition is really annoying, and viewers might be like, listen, I don't want to waste my time to listen to another show because I've heard this before. I know it's the same thing anyway. So you want to really avoid that. And so if you're able to stand out, if you're able to differentiate yourself, if you're able to bring in anything in, if you're able to be creative, if you're able to be inventive, if you can innovate in your show, folks will love to listen to you, and you will grow your listenership. Now, if you're talking about how to choose the right podcast format for your show, you also need to think about how you will promote your show, because the format of the show will play an important role in the communication, in the promotion style that you adopt for your show. And so how you plan to promote your show can also impact the podcast format that you choose. You might have experience in a marketing channel or podcasting marketing assets in place that favor one format over another. In these cases, it's really smart to align your format with your channel/assets. What do I mean by that? Let me just break it down for you. I mean, this might sound a little complex, so you might be like, okay, what the F this guy talking about? Let me give you a few examples. If you are a science fiction author and you have an online following, a podcast theater type show makes the most sense because you have an existing audience who likes that content. You've done it before. Everybody's comfortable with it. You run a few shows using that format, and you know it works. Folks have left you reviews. People have left you reviews. So you know listeners love that kind of show, and you already have the audience. So why don't try to reinvent the wheel? Just rinse and repeat. And if you are embedded in a professional industry, an interview show seems reasonable because you have access to lots of guests who will promote their appearances on your show to their audiences. Again, when you talk about a B2B sort of topic, then you really want to be a little serious, right? Quote unquote serious. So you don't want to really have like a theater following, whatever. And when you actually are doing if you are in a professional industry, you don't need to have an existing following because folks will come to you anyway. For example, if you have guests on your shows, those guests, they will promote your shows because they will promote their appearances on your shows. And folks will always search for podcasts using keywords. So again, it's kind of similar to if you go on LinkedIn being the quintessential platform for professionals. So if you go and search for keywords, you will have access to a lot of industries, a lot of folks. It's the same way. And if you have close contacts within a podcast network, you might choose a format and subject that aligns with the network so you can join one day, right? It's all about making sure that you choose whatever you choose is aligned with what you want your listeners to actually hear. Okay, but it's really important to think about your promotion strategy from the get-go. Very, very critical. You also need to have a clear idea about the format that aligns with your brand. Okay, so you got to ask yourself, which format aligns with my brand? If you have an existing company or organization, you want to consider the state of your brand. If you already have a well-developed brand, it's a great idea to choose a podcast format that fits into that structure, right? Because what you want is you want to have brand consistency. You don't want to have like some kind of, you don't want your branding to be dissonant, right? So if you have brand consistency, this will ensure that you create a cohesive experience for your audience without alienating people. It's all about cohesion here, cohesiveness. If your podcast doesn't mesh with your brand, there is a good chance that your audience will be confused and fade away. For example, let's say you have a popular blog where you conduct interviews with professionals in the entertainment industry. In this case, it would make sense to start a podcast that does the same thing, interviews guests. You could also host a solo monologue show where you recount your adventures in the entertainment industry, but there's a little outside of your audience comfort zone. You might lose some people who prefer to hear about the lives and work or other actors and musicians, not yours. Now imagine if you started a panel podcast where you and your friends sit around, if you sat around a table playing Dungeons and Dragons. That kind of show could definitely be successful, but not for your brand. It's just too far removed from what your audience expects. That's what I said before. It's all about what your audience expects, and it's also about the kind of experience you want your audience to have. Your podcast exists. Your podcast is successful. Your podcast is actually efficient if you have the right community, if you have the right listener community, folks who are interested, folks who are committed to you, folks who want to root for you. This is why your fundamental question should always be, how do you place your listeners? If you were your own listener, would you want to listen to yourself? This is really important. Those are important questions you got to ask yourself continually. Boss, I want to quickly remind you of today's topic. We're having a conversation about how to choose the right podcast format for your show. We also want to talk about the format that aligns with your style. If you want to choose the right podcast format for your show, you need to actually dig deeper and be really granular. You need to be granular in terms of the format that aligns with your style. Let me just kind of break it down for you. You need to consider your personal preferences, your personality, your style. Because at the end of the day, yes, it's true that you need to care about the listeners, but you are the one actually narrating. You are the one talking. You are the one recording. If you don't feel comfortable, if you adopt a style that is dichotomous with your personality, if you adopt a style that is contradictory to your real self, you're not going to succeed. I mean, you might actually maybe succeed once or two months, but for the long term, in terms of sustainability, you're not going to succeed. And as the podcast host, you have to like your format. You have to enjoy sitting down to craft and record new episodes. You have to enjoy talking about your show and shamelessly promoting it. Okay? Look at it this way. If you do not enjoy your format, you will dread creating new content. You will struggle to find the motivation, the inspiration to hunt for new guests, and you will ask your guests lackluster questions. You will settle for good enough whenever you craft a podcast script instead of striving to make the best content possible. Furthermore, if you like what you're doing, you'll get better at it over time because you will care about it. You will constantly look for ways to make your show better, produce better content, and engage with your audience. And you will care enough to put in the extra effort to land that tough guest, explain that complex topic, or boost your show's production value. And those things are an important element because you might be thinking, well, those are not quantifiable, but The non-quantifiable elements are what makes your podcast successful in the long run. Okay, so do not choose a format that is completely out of your wheelhouse. You'll hit the work, you will burn out quickly, and probably pod fade. And you don't want that. You don't want to pod fade. And so make sure to choose the podcast format that makes you happy. You have to be happy first. If you're happy, you are going to make your listeners happy. You're going to add value to your listeners' lives, to your listeners' careers, to your listeners' enterprises, whatever they're working on. And this is what it is. So you are the star of the show here. Your listeners are the second leg of they are important as well. But number one, you got to take care of yourself first. And please, so when you sit down and think about the format that you are actually thinking about, make sure that you like the format. One thing I need to say here is that whether you choose an interview style, a panel style, a monologue style, a vlog style, whatever it is, make sure that you like it, but make sure also that it syncs very well with your brand. Let's close to today's conversation. I want to give you a bonus here. If you're still here, I want to really talk about switching podcast formats. One thing I want to say here is that it's simply because you choose a format from the get-go doesn't mean that you can't change. Of course you can change. You can do anything. You can change the format. You can revamp the format. You can do anything you want. As long as you are inspired, as long as it syncs with your brain, it syncs with what your listeners are expecting, you should do really well. Okay. And what I want to say here is that choosing a podcast format may feel like a big decision, but it's quite essential to keep in mind that you're not locked into your format forever. It's totally possible to change. In fact, many successful podcasts have changed formats without losing a single download. And furthermore, it's quite possible to dip your toes into a new podcast format without committing all the way. For instance, if you typically host interviews, it's okay to sprinkle a panel episode or a solo monologue every once in a while. As long as you don't veer too far from what your audience expects, no one will actually mind. And your audience members may even enjoy an occasional change of pace. Okay, but it's always important to understand that you need to have consistency. And every now and then you can have an exception, right? Let's say like every day you're eating at 6 p.m., you're having dinner at 6 p.m. And once in a while, once a quarter or once every 2 months, you eat at 5 o'clock. You know, instead of eating, you just have like a different food or whatever. Nobody will mind. As long as you keep the 80%, 90% consistent, you are good to go. So one thing I need to say though, keep in mind that you can't transition too far without losing some of your audience. If your format for topics changes too much, you might find yourself producing a show that your current audience does not enjoy. You'll have to begin building a new audience from the beginning, and you really don't want to do that. Okay. So bottom line here is you need to choose wisely. Okay. Your choice of podcast format has a big impact on your show. It will guide how you create content, whom you invite as a guest, and how you and possibly your team work to record and publish episodes. There is no law that says you have to use one of the podcast formats that we actually talked about in today's conversation, but they're popular for a reason. So is it just because they work? So make sure to give this question plenty of thoughts and choose the right format for yourself. Thank you so much for your attention. I really appreciate it. And in today's conversation, I spoke to you about how to choose the right podcast format for your show. So I give you the overview. I give you a few pro tips. I give you the approach to really think about and the bonus. Thank you so much. God bless you. I'll speak to you another time. But until then, remember, stay marvelous.